There we go. Okay, do this. Voila. Okay, hello and welcome everyone to History Matters, and really so does coffee. Today we're going to talk about framing, how things are framed, particularly in the press, and how that shapes how we understand them, which I picked as a topic because there was a story in the newspaper and the framing of it really irked me. And I was like, oh, there's my topic. But before we plunge into the topic, I will turn to my partner in crime, Grace, who will explain the rules of the game.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us here at the National Council for History Education. Joanne, thank you for being with us for 102 episodes. We're thrilled to have you every Friday. I did also just want to say, as you'll note behind me, we are in the midst of our NCHE Online Conference 2022. So if you are intrigued, if you enjoy what Joanne has to say and you want to hear from lots of other incredible historians, like we've got Peniel Joseph coming up, we've got Alexis Coe, lots of other amazing folks, incredible breakout sessions by educators from across the country, and of course, history of trivia tonight, which I see you all. I know you'd be good at that. So do sign up, and that's ncheteach.org/conference. And you can see more of Joanne's episodes at ncheteach.org/conversations. All right, please participate in the chat actively. We know that you will. And then if you do have questions for Joanne, put them in the Q&A and I will pull those out and ask her at the end. All right, so thank you very much, and I'll hand it to Joanne.
Okay, excellent. Wonderful. So as I said, we're going to talk about framing. And by framing, I do mean the way that particularly the media, the press, frames what we read. So the words they use and the way that they organize something and the tone of it and the organization of it, any number of different things that shape how a story is told, how news is being revealed to us, told to us, more almost than the content of it. So you can really shape how people respond to a message by the proper framing. And actually, I had joked a moment ago about talking about science, and here I am. I'm actually going to offer a little tiny bit of science, and I will come back obviously at the end to framing in current news because it was being irked at something in the news along the lines of what I'll come back to at the end of my comments here that led me to this topic. And as you'll hear today, when I talk about framing, it's hardly new. It's not as though there's this new phenomenon in the late 20th century called framing. It's always can be a part of how you're reading news or hearing news or learning of news, right? It's you decide how to tell a story, and the how matters a lot. Now, here's my little 3 seconds of science. There were apparently experiments done in the 1980s. And the names here are not easy to say, so forgive me if there are people out there who know these people and I am messing up their names. By Nobel Prize winner Daniel, I believe it's Kahneman, and his collaborator Amos Tversky. Not bad for first thing in the morning. And they did a project that basically determined that we don't always, in reading things, we don't always necessarily respond rationally. That we're shaped sometimes by things that trigger our brain into a shortcut, or to put it in the way that they put it. We often rely on a number of mental shortcuts to speed up our reasoning. And what that means is that we can be really, really sensitive to how things are framed beyond the point where we realize it. And in this particular case, I believe one of the things that they did was they described, it was a news story that was identical in every way, 2 different versions. And one of them said, crime is a beast feeding on our community. And the other one said, crime is a virus savaging our community, and had different groups read these accounts. And lo and behold, the people who just saw the word beast, the only difference is beast and virus, the beast people ended up wanting punitive measures when they were asked, punitive measures taken to correct the problem. And the people who read the virus version wanted reformative measures to help fix things, which is really interesting. And apparently, according to, and again, this is based on my very deep 15 minutes of reading this morning, so forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, but the idea was just the use of beast or virus shaped how people understood and responded to this news story. And when they were asked afterwards, they didn't pick up, they couldn't say, well, that word beast, that really threw me off. They had no awareness of what led them in that direction. So framing, in that case, the choice of a word can really have an impact. The historical example that I want to focus on, and some of you might know this, and I'll actually be curious, but what I want to talk about is the debate over the Constitution and Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, which pretty much set the terms of debate. And I'll start out by saying some of this comes from a book that some of you might not know of because it's not necessarily that well known, called The Selling of the Constitutional Convention, A History of News Coverage by Don Alexander, which is a really interesting book. So at any rate, he talks about some of this is more widely known, that the Federalists branded themselves the Federalists and branded their opponents the Anti-Federalists. Now that's some strategic framing, right? That's saying that these other people, they're not for anything particularly, they're just anti-us, which puts the us, the Federalists, at the center of the conversation. So that's just really smart framing. And although the Anti-Federalists during the Constitutional Convention, the debate over the Constitution and its ratification, denied that name and actually rarely used that name to refer to themselves, it pretty much stuck. It was very clear, it communicated something really well, and the Federalists, given their focus on national connections of one kind or another, were really effective at spreading that idea. They were really effective, not surprisingly, at framing what was happening in a way that helped them. So the simple word anti-federalist in and of itself is a framing device. And the anti-federalist, interestingly, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's not one I'm particularly intended to address this morning, but what do you do when you're being framed? Right? So the Anti-Federalists tried, they would sign, for example, some of their essays and public correspondence, a federal farmer, right? Federal, playing around with the meaning of the word, which actually did have a somewhat amorphous meaning at that time. But pretty much Anti-Federalists stuck to the point that that's how we often, probably most of us, frame the debate today. The selling of the Constitutional Convention, I just appear in the chat. At any rate, so Anti-Federalists suggested that the other folk were obstructors more than anything else, and that the people who were standing for something were the Federalists. And the press, again, Federalists, the Federalist press, centered on that narrative by really playing up, pitching and selling the Constitution, the need for it, and then the need for the ratification of it, by playing up the negative. So the press, for the most part, wasn't like, let us discuss all of the fine and wonderful things that you will get if we reframe in some way the articles and create a new constitution, or if we ratify the Constitution that has just emerged from the convention. Instead, the press very often just centered on the terrible, the horrible, we're all going down, right? The press very much found every negative and every fear and every horror that they could display, saying that if we don't do this, horrible things will happen. Again, pretty effective framing, right? That if you can convince people that not doing something is deadly and do it in a convincing way, and as we've discussed here on History Matters many times, using propaganda, getting people afraid of something and having them respond emotionally rather than rationally, that's really effective, right? We see that all the time in our current political climate of, and very often it's the Republican press, but it is sometimes also the Democratic press, so it's left and right sometimes, using fear, not like, we're going to use fear and really get them, but really hyping up fear as a way to get people to drum them up and get them engaged in part of the cause. Hate is another component here. That's another story, but that's the same idea, right? Getting people afraid or hateful, really angry, and then using that emotion to grab a hold of people's thoughts and assumptions and loyalties. That's powerful. That's a constant theme. And that plays into this theme as well. Framing can very often involve emotion. So, for example, one newspaper said, if we don't have this new constitution, well, we will be exchanging tyranny for anarchy. Like, there's nothing subtle about these arguments. There's an essay, an example of this, that shows the flip side of the coin, probably written by Benjamin Rush in the Pennsylvania Gazette on May 30th of 1787. And he signed it Harrington. And his essay, rather than saying, den of horrors, we're all going down, we need to support this convention and we need to support the Constitution, he went on the flip side as far as framing what the convention was doing and went a little overboard in praising it. Again, framing it so that if you read it, and you'll hear in a moment, I'll offer some examples, it would be hard to resist the assumption that this is a fine, noble, and lofty thing. He let's just say he exaggerated somewhat. So, for example, he claimed that many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention had signed the Declaration of Independence. Many of them had fought on the battlefield. Quote, perhaps no age or country saw more wisdom, patriotism, and probity united in a single assembly than we now behold in the Convention of the States. Nothing, no hyping done there. And of course, he emphasized again and again, the immortal Washington is leading them, right? So it's like this, what an assembly, the immortal Washington is leading them. These are people who signed the Declaration, who shed blood on the battlefield. Okay, maybe not all necessarily true, but in that kind of framing, if people aren't doing what we're doing here and thinking, wait a minute, how many of them actually signed the Declaration? How many people signed the Declaration overall? You're just going to think Declaration, Washington, shedding blood on the battlefield. Ooh, like these are real patriots. You can see how that kind of, again, emotional framing could have an impact. Now, in the case of the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate, obviously that is not the reason why the Federalists won the day, the Constitution passed, but the way in which they discussed, promoted, and explained the Constitution and the effort to have one, the need for the convention, and then the ratification process had a lot to do with it. I mean, and this brings us back to the most obvious framing of all, and that's the Federalist Essays, which I will say, and I might have said this once before, were never called the Federalist Papers. That we've sort of given them that name afterwards. They were called the Federalist, and they were a series of essays in the newspaper. The Federalist, and I teach them this way all the time because students may not have preconceived notions, but I think a lot of people out in the world assume that the Federalist Essays are sage interpretation, objective interpretation of the Constitution by the people involved in its creation, right? And they're cited all the time in constitutional reasoning and legal situations, right? That the Federalist shows you what the founders really thought. Now, I could say here, as I will, there is no single founder's blob, as I've said many a time. You can't say the founders thought, because that's almost true of nothing. We could probably find some things, but certainly in the realm of politics, the founders thought is a very difficult thing to say because it's usually not true. But in this case, it's important to realize that the Federalist Essays were not really objective. They were very subjective. They were created by, I mean, certainly John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton were the three main authors. Jay dropped out because of illness, or actually, I think really more of an injury, but at either rate, Jay dropped out. So it's Madison and Hamilton who are two of the main proponents of the desperate need for a new constitution, for strengthening the government, and then for supporting and getting the Constitution ratified. So they have an agenda. And when you read the Federalist Essays, you realize, although they're not, for the most part, out and out lying, there are a couple of moments where it's like, but still, they're not presenting, here objectively is some evidence, draw your own conclusions. The Federalists, to be blunt and a little crass about it, are a commercial advertisement for the Constitution. They are, let us offer you 200, yes, 200 reasons why we need this Constitution. And if you order now, you'll get this free sponge, whatever. I can't make up the commercial right now in my head. I wish I could. But at any rate, they are pitching the Constitution. They are trying to engage people to want the Constitution. And along the lines of what I just said of using sometimes fear or anxiety to get people in line with your cause, they say, for example, at one point, I believe it's Hamilton actually in one of the early essays within the first, before number 10, so it's in those first couple of essays, might even be in number 1, says, we hear it out in the world. We're hearing discussion of people who just want to break apart the Union, who just don't even want us to be together anymore, that our entire country could go down. No. I mean, maybe there were some people talking about that, I don't know, but it's not as though there was a wave of people who were speaking out against the Confederation entirely, and that something must be done. But by dropping that, and it's literally, I believe, a sentence or two in the middle of an essay, that's framing. That's of a particular kind. That is, we even hear this horrible thing being discussed. And just think of it, if that thing is being discussed, what does it mean about the fate of our new nation? So framing is pretty vitally important. I'm going to mention what set me off on this topic, and then I want to mention a little bit about framing in the press today and in the news today. What set me off was an article in, I believe, the New York Times that talked about Zelensky's speech before Congress and Biden's response. And it framed it like, I don't know if you want to call it a competition or a sporting event, but it was like, Zelensky did this and Biden came back with this. Biden, 79 years old and wearing a blue suit, Zelensky wearing a t-shirt. It was when you, and I'm not going to be able to reproduce it, and I did not have time this morning to capture it, but you will easily be able to find it, I am sure. And you certainly can find my tweet where I said, please stop framing news as a sporting event. It was like, rather than saying the president of Ukraine asked for these important things, and here's how Biden responded, and here are the implications, it set it up as a competition between these two guys. And think what that does, right? On any number of levels. It trivializes what's happening, right? It's so that you're not in the front of your mind, the thing right in front of you when reading that story isn't, okay, so we're talking about warfare on a broad scale. We're talking about a country under attack. We're talking about the big question of what the United States should or shouldn't do and the implications of that. And instead, you're getting old guy in a suit and young guy in a t-shirt, and they're going at each other. Really? So it trivializes and even, sort of submerges what's being said, which is the actual important part of it, and makes it into almost like a sporting event or something that you can sort of stand back and watch and cheer for one person or another. The trivialization of the message at this point concerning this topic is so dangerous. And in so many ways, we are becoming, not because of the press, but because of the ocean of crises that are unfolding around us these days, we are becoming numb in some ways to the significance of some of what's happening around us over other things, right? We're becoming a little bit desensitized because there's so much. A story, a framing that plays right into that, and it doesn't say, this is really important, let's talk about why this is important, but instead says, cool, it's a competition. That's not helping at all. And that's not really offering useful information. in the way that it should, up front and center. Important exchange. What did it say? What did it mean? Now, I did a little bit of online research because I was so irked at that. I was really irked at that because it happens so often. And I'm sure some of you, I'm trying very desperately not to look at what people are saying in chat, but it happens so often that particularly concerning Ukraine and or Russia and or Putin and or Republicans and Democrats, it's framed as a competition or a contest or a sporting event or a horse race, or all of these metaphors and similes that are often used when it comes to politics, but sometimes are more, I don't want to say more appropriate, safer than other times. In the middle of a crisis, you just don't play at game or race. You just don't. What becomes important in a crisis is information and knowledge. And that's what should be at the front of any reportage. So there's a project, an organization called the Project for Excellence in Journalism, which is a tax-exempt research organization that initially was affiliated with the Columbia School of Journalism, and now I believe is part of the Pew Research Center. So they did a study, and they looked at, I believe, the front pages of a lot of newspapers for a period of several months. And what they found, not surprisingly, was, and these are their words, the press shows a decided tendency to present the news through a combative lens. And it said particularly, the frames of conflict, winners and losers, and revealing wrongdoing accounted for 30% of all of the stories on these front pages, twice the number of straight news accounts. And this, as they put it, this penchant for framing stories around combat and contest is even more pronounced at the top of the front page, and is truer still when it comes to describing the actions or statements of government officials, right? So the front pages, the top of the front pages, highly focused on, it's a contest, it's a combat, and particularly talking about government officials, rather than explaining what's happening and how things work. So 30% of all of the stories they found had this combat lens. 12% of these stories were, as they put it, explanatory frames, where how what's happening fits into larger trends or historical context for what's going on now. 12% were explanatory, which really tells you something, right? And might not, certainly is not something, while I'm sitting here griping about the degree to which we focus on contest and competition, I had not certainly stood back and said, and what is the breakdown actually? Like how prominent is that? It's really, really prominent. And as far as stories that focus on policy, that actually debate or discuss, not even debate, discuss policy and its impact on the front page, 8% of the stories. So that's a lot of combat and competition on the front page. And I know when you say this anywhere, particularly on social media, people say, yeah, but it's click driven, right? They want to get eyes on the first page, people to buy the paper, people to click on your story on social media. And that may be true. That doesn't mean the impact of that is any less important, right? It means it's a fact right now in the way that a number of really serious crises are being covered, that's shaping in ways that we do and don't realize how we're responding to those crises. And our response individually, on a group level, on a national level, really matters. So the framing, I think I titled this Framing Matters. Framing really matters. I should have made it all capital and included a lot of exclamation points. Framing is enormous. And part of the trick of it really is we don't necessarily realize when it's happening. We don't see that the word beast triggered us or the word virus triggered us. We don't see it. We read it and we respond to it. So some of these press outlets, analysis outlets online offered a series of things to think about when you're trying to decide the framing of a piece. And I'm going to offer them, of a piece of news. And I'm going to offer them now, since in many ways, we always end one of our discussions with me ideally coming up with some way for you to think before you respond, because very often the response is the key, and people are saying things in an extreme manner to get you to respond emotionally before you can actually think. So some of these are obvious, but they're not necessarily obvious when you're reading a news item. So I'll lay them out here. What do you do when you're reading a story to try and figure out how it's being framed if the framing isn't obvious? Okay, number one, and this is an obvious one, but again, you might not think about it. Who exactly are the main sources for that piece of news? Who are the people who they're talking to? Who are the people who are defining terms in an article? Who is setting the tone and the agenda of the report? You know, you read that kind of a certain kind of news story and you're like, you know, so-and-so from so-and-so says, but if you pause and actually think who the so-and-sos are, sometimes there's enough of a pattern there that it becomes much clearer than it was before about the assumption going into the writing of the article. Along similar lines, when you read an article, are there patterns or themes that when you think about it, when you read them looking for patterns and themes, like historians do all the time when they're looking at evidence, are there obvious patterns or themes that you can see? And if so, what does that suggest? Is there a narrative that is generally being followed in the piece? Is there an underlying story that is framing and sweeping you along with what is being said? What kind of language, what kind of words are being used? Right? What again, we get back to beast and virus, but really, what do you note about the language? And obviously, unusual words would be one thing to notice. I do that all the time as a historian, or, and I know I've said this before, sometimes I'll just record on a single, actually, I'm the last index card user in the world, on a single index card and then multiple index cards when I see people using a phrase or a word that strikes me as interesting because I wouldn't expect it, like referring during the election of 1800, the very fraught election of 1800, using terms like civil war and anarchy. Enough people said that. It was like, well, okay, so that's right at the center of their mind. That's right here. So what does that mean? What does it suggest? So looking for the kind of language being used. How are different people or groups being represented in a news piece? And by this specifically, I mean othering, right? There's like us and the others. Is there othering taking place in something that you're reading? How are gender and or class being portrayed? Is there some kind of clear bias? And in that case, sometimes it's very obvious. But again, you need to pause to think about it. And then last but not least, are there images, are there pictures, are there charts being used? And how might they influence what you're thinking? Again, in ways that you might not even realize, but that can be very pronounced. So I'm a little bit over my time here, but the underlying message here is think about how the news that you're reading or hearing or watching, think about how it's being framed. If it's playing into the, you know, contest, combat, horse race, sporting event narrative, if that's how it's being framed, pause for a minute and think about the reality of what's going on, right? It may feel like that, or people who are reporting may want it to be like that because the tempo of that and the energy of that is very useful in reporting news. But particularly at a moment of crisis, when life and death decisions are always potentially being made, that is not useful. That trivializes the information and the knowledge. It trivializes our responses to the information and knowledge and takes the actual crisis of the moment out of the frame. So that is my I suppose my message or lesson for the day. Think about the framing and then think about the message or the content or the knowledge that should be in the center of the frame. That's what we need to see more of. Okay, I'm going to stop. I got you could tell I was really irked by that, by that article, not because it was so horrible. It just like crystallized for me something that I've been seeing a lot of, and for all of the reasons that I just vented about, really angers me because it's easily avoidable. And it's just, you know, in a sense, emotion manipulating to pull people into the news. It's not, I'm not saying it's deliberately evil, but it sure is harmful. Okay, and what I haven't seen, remarkably, I'm glancing down now, no one has said mug, mug, mug. Oh, thank you, Carolee, but I beat you. I beat you. Okay, so the mug I am using, you have not seen before. And it has two sides and only one of them really applies. Well, no, actually they both apply. Okay, anyway, Bess sent me the mug. And here's the side that I thought really applied. It's just the mess. The mess of ink, right? It's just like, yeah, there we are, right? Just a big blot of, oh no. So the other side though says, today we are making history. This is the side I thought of when I was like, what mug for framing? What mug for framing? This is what I thought of, but today we are making history at History Matters. So that one is appropriate too. So thank you, Bess, for the mug, which I love, and particularly the goofball side I love, but thank you for thinking of me. And I think you told me it was from Colonial Williamsburg, maybe? Blob of Frost. Could be a band name. I'm with you. Anyway, okay. That is my spiel. And now we go back to Grace and open things up. That's right, our 102nd episode. I know you said that at the beginning, Grace, but I have to have my moment of marveling at that because I remain in disbelief. I did this all the time with Matt too. It's like, Matt, 85 episodes. Kind of remarkable.
That's a wonderful thing. And we're so pleased to have you all with us here. Again, it would not be a Friday morning without you all. So we've got some wonderful questions coming in, Joanne. This is obviously something that people care about a lot. I know I am just delighted to have someone to talk about New York Times articles with. So
Indeed, it was in the New York Times. And yeah.
I keep sending them to people and they go, there's a paywall. And I'm like, I know. I have to talk to someone.
But I must vent. Yeah, no, I know. But yeah.
All right. So we have both historical and modern questions. I'm a little torn with what to start with. We'll start with way back stuff. All right. Dale wants to know, in the Federalist Anti-Federalist time period, was the issue of patriotism brought into the debate?
Yeah.
And is that used as a framing mechanism?
Oh, for sure. And you had both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists claiming that they were being true to the spirit of fill in the blank, right? And that's why, Benjamin Rush saying, these guys, they were on the battlefield, right? These guys, they signed a founding document. These guys, playing at that idea that it's the ultimate patriotism if you can link yourself with those things. But sure, the Anti-Federalists were claiming they represented the real spirit of what the United States was supposed to be, that these other people, these people who in their mind should have been called nationalists, right? The Federalists in their mind, what's scary about them is that they're nationalizing, centering, consolidating power in a scary way. Those nationalists don't represent what's really the United States. We represent what's really the United States. So yeah, patriotism was being plugged in, and particularly in the 1780s and 1790s, because you had people who, not necessarily all sitting at the Constitutional Convention, had fought in the Revolution, had been part of that combat, who had shed blood or lost family members and had been, fighting a war on their home ground, that the patriotism argument had real power. So yeah, that was something that was used a lot, just generally throughout the period. You could hearken back to the Revolution. You were doing that before people who had fought in or suffered at the hands of the Revolution in some way. And so that kind of a link and saying patriotic, linking with that could have a real power.
All right, thank you. Lindsay, I don't know if you have this right to hand, but Lindsay Gribble wondered if you could just repeat that study about framing. There's been lots of discussion in the chat, so.
Yes, okay. So it was from the Project for Excellence in Journalism. It was done in conjunction, and I didn't write this down, but like the Princeton Agency for Survey or something. I can find the link if you guys can't, though you're always magical. And it was like a report that I think I searched on something as easy as framing and news or something, and saw a lot of studies came up, actually, a lot of them did. But it's Project for Excellence in Journalism, done in conjunction with a Princeton Agency for Survey Research. mean, combative lens was one of the phrases that they used in the piece, so that would help finding it too.
Well, I would challenge our archivists and researchers
You guys are
in the
so good at
audience. Let's
this.
see who can find it first. Go
Yeah.
to it. Thank you. Sounds like a fascinating study. All right. So, Cece,
Okay.
what?
Is that, I don't know if that's it, Lindsay, but Lindsay just posted a link. So
Fantastic. Good job. She found it herself. Good work. Answer your own question. All right. Cece says, as a history teacher, professor, we try to teach that authors are biased simply because everything is biased in some way. Nothing is 100% objective. So along those lines, how to screen media is a tough call. So just some suggestions for when we're talking for our students, whether they're younger students or college students. How do you help them with that screening of media?
Screening meaning how they think about, or how they telling them how to think about what they're seeing.
I think so. Yeah. To make sure they keep that in their head that while things may appear purely objective, they're not. So just tips you might give your own students, or that even a teacher of younger students might use.
Well, for my students, I mostly deal with that in the realm of printed, letters and newspapers of the time. One assignment that I actually did, it's been a little while since I've done it, but it worked really well, was I asked students to find, I can't remember how I did it. I either asked students, I think I asked some students, half the students, to go out and find a report about X issue from a Federalist newspaper, and then the other from a Republican newspaper. And then we got together and saw that basically you would not know that that was the same thing, and you could even, again, this is for older students, you could even offer them access to 2 or 3 different Federalist or Republican newspapers, and it covered something that was really controversial or that was contested a lot. And you would see that it's hard to know that the same thing is happening. And of course, you don't necessarily tell your students, like, it's always true that way too today. The simple fact that newspapers could report things in that biased a manner is a real, it drove home in a powerful way that when you're reading things from this time period, you really have to think about the agenda and the frame. And we talk a lot about word choice and the tone of things. Actually, this might be something to think about too. When I have students reading primary evidence letters from one person to another, particularly long ones or seemingly dense letters, I will ask students in their gut, what does this make them feel? Like what emotion comes to you when you read this? There's a letter, and I always do this with this letter. There's a letter from Alexander Hamilton to a Virginia Federalist named Edward Carrington in 1792. And Hamilton tells Carrington, I'm going to explain to you the state of parties, 1792. And you need to hear this from me. And it must have been a 30-page letter, or printed in a volume published, it's 20 pages or whatever. It's huge. But what I tell my students, rather than having them see like, well, he hated Madison for this and he just trusted Jefferson for that, I ask, what's your gut response to it? And what it really reads like, and what it really is actually saying, Madison was my friend first and Jefferson took him away. And Madison agreed with me, and now I don't know what to think about Madison. There's an undercurrent that's personal and angry, and some student usually says, it feels like high school. It's like, okay, so now what does that mean in the realm of politics in this period? And it gets students beyond the Federalist versus Republican sort of lofty arguments down into the realm of politics is really personal, that the political and the personal are bound up together, that parties aren't these official organizations where, you march ahead forward with a party label, that all of this, I'm going to say fraught again, is fraught in a way that would not be apparent, but is handily made really apparent in that letter. So sometimes I think the gut response question, even though it might feel like a goofy question, or even though it potentially is a question that doesn't get, well, I was gonna say doesn't get a useful response, might not get a response, but any response that's useful, because any response, any student that says, it makes me feel this, you've got people thinking on the level that you need to think on, I think, when you're reading or hearing what people are saying. If you, in a sense, if you turn that kind of framing against itself. If you ask students, what does this make you feel, which is the point of something, the framing, that undercuts, right? That's like, yeah, it's being framed some way. And rather than saying, how's it framed? How does this make you feel? Why does it make you feel that way? Well, let's look at the piece and see how it made you feel that way is an interesting way of making that kind of interpretation accessible, I think, to a lot of people.
And I think, so you're speaking of historical documents here, but I think that there's a lot that we can take out of that and translate to modern media.
Oh, exactly.
So
and that's what I mean.
looking at look at 3 different versions.
Exactly.
4 different versions, 6 different versions.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And show, find the reporting, 2 different news, opposed news channels reporting the same thing. And rather than getting students absolutely focused initially on what they're saying, ask them their gut response, what makes them feel. And then get at why you feel that way. And then you So I don't think it just applies to documents at all.
Yeah, and I think that emotional piece is so important. And there are so many articles I read where I often need to stop and go, okay, this is making me feel afraid.
I know, well, angry. More often than not, I get angry and I have to stop. I have to not retweet, not, just take deep breaths because this made me so angry. And that's not a good sign, Joanne.
Yeah.
That's if it makes you that angry, why? And some things they should, but again, very often it's the framing.
And for those of you looking for resources, the Stanford History Education Group has some amazing work on how to teach your students how to analyze online media. And the museum no longer physically exists, but it does exist online, and its teacher resources still exist. So those are places that you can go as well. And this is again, I know a lot of you are not teachers, because if you did, you'd be teaching 3rd period right now. And some of you just have 3rd period off, so welcome. But close reading, it's so interesting because we're at the conference. I watched this incredible presentation yesterday by the Georgia Historical Society on using close reading on historical markers, those roadside ones that I almost wrecked the car because I tried to read the whole paragraph while I'm going by at 50. But it was fascinating. And those ideas of close reading, and of course, Georgia has been putting these up for 75 years. So the language changes depending on when it was put up. So taking that time to look at those particularly charged words, why are they using those words? It's a lot of the same skills. So I just think it's fascinating. It makes me happy. What we're teaching in the classroom is also relevant outside as well. So
that's very true. One of the courses I'm teaching is a graduate course on public history. And in one way or another, we were just talking about those roadside, postings. But that's true. You go to a museum or a historical site, and it's not that the National Park Service is deliberately trying to lead people astray, but it's just the framing is part of what's being done. And so it's useful to think about what the framing is and how that might be shaping your understanding of what's going on. It's true. History needs framing recognition.
Yes. All right. Sorry, I've got a long list. I want to make sure we get to everybody here. This is a great question from Mary. So we've been mostly talking about print that we're reading, but Mary says, what about the effect of photos and videos? She says, my Gannett newspaper has chosen photos of Biden giving a speech that seemed to make him look as old as possible. But I think, so that may be a specific example, but I think we can see that a lot. The choice of photographs and even how photographs are taken, it's a similar thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Which photos are being chosen for what purpose. So yeah, you can tell, right? That very often a newspaper of one stripe of politics will find a photo of someone from the other stripe of politics that is not particularly appealing, or even more, and in this case, more manipulative. We've certainly seen a lot of cases in the past when some kind of press outlet will tinker with a photo, darken someone's skin, slightly change the facial features in like campaign literature to, again, deploy racism and to get that built into part of their message, to get people riled up. So yeah, pictures matter enormously. But it is true that boy, does he look old in that picture, is that can be a subtle form of influence, right? Because I mean, he is an older person, but there were probably much more flattering pictures. So that's a case in which the framing would be very effective, because you can't absolutely say, why were they doing that? And yet the fact is, yeah, the photo editor chose that photo. Why? Why was that chosen? What does that suggest? Again, in some cases, like this case, you can't draw that kind of straight line and say the editor chose the photo to make Biden look bad. But you can certainly say, interesting that they chose that photo when I think it makes him look really old. Interesting. You might then want to go look at like other newspapers framing what photo they use for the same event and what photos that specific newspaper uses for Biden and other events. And then there you have a little report that you could assign your students as to, how are people framing this one event, just like the news has a frame. In what ways are the photos giving different messages in different newspapers?
And of course, this is not just photos, as we've discussed in other weeks. This goes back to lithographs and even older images as well, that you're always seeing. Yeah. There's always choices being made about what's in the image.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. This is interesting. This is not entirely just about framing, but I think it relates. In your opinion, did the Anti-Federalists propose any valid points that they don't get credit for?
The Bill of Rights.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. That was one of their main contributions. I mean, they were in some ways very reactive against the seemingly nationalist agenda of the Federalists, but they insisted that there should be some kind of a Bill of Rights. And that was, the ratification came about because there was a promise that a Bill of Rights would come. So yeah, they should get credit. That's a big one. Yeah. Not that it would have happened otherwise, but that was a really firm demand on their part.
All right, thank you. So James says, was framing easier or more difficult historically when there were fewer media sources that penetrated less deeply and widely than perhaps today's do?
Repeat the question again for me.
Was framing easier or more difficult historically when there were fewer media sources that penetrated less deeply and widely?
Oh, framing would have been more effective because it would be, and particularly if you're going all the way back in time to, the late 18th and the big chunk of the first half of the 19th century, if there's fewer media, kinds of media, sources of media, numbers of newspapers, you could say something pretty darn crazy in one of them, and people may or may not have access to something that contests it. And if they do, how do you sort between that, right? It's very easy to say something pretty outrageous if you can't really check it in any way. I mean, in the time period I most often write about, in the late 18th century, you'll see people writing letters to each other, elite political folk writing letters to each other and saying things like, either I read in the newspaper that Congress is doing X, but I have no way of knowing that. And you're in Congress. Are they? Or the newspapers, Congress is out of session. And now I have no way to confirm national news. I have to sneeze. Oops. My mother would have said sneezing on the truth. That Congress is out of session. So I don't know how to confirm that things are true or not. In that case, it could be framing. It could just be out and out lies, right? And it becomes really hard to fact check anything. How do you fact check? Nowadays, there's so much that you fact check and you're like, is that a fact? Well, these 5 people say it is, and these 5 people say it isn't. We have a different problem trying to determine what facts actually are, but that similar problem for very different reasons when you have fewer media sources.
Thank you. And we do have the question, does framing self-select readership?
Yeah.
And has it historically?
Oh, historically. I mean, I said yeah instantly because obviously you will drift towards a media outlet of some kind that is along the lines of what you believe, right? So you would read the New York Times and you might not really want to watch Fox News. So yeah, it might, sort of lead you in one direction or another, historically speaking. Yeah, actually. And what I thought of it was, there's an anecdote from a South Carolinian named William Loughton Smith, and he writes a letter to Hamilton, I want to say like 1792, 1793, when partisan politics is really heating up. And he goes and wanders around the South Carolina backcountry, kind of, like reporting information to Hamilton on, here's the state of politics in the South Carolina backcountry. And one of the things he does is he knocks on farmhouse doors and then looks to see which newspaper is on the mantle of the fireplace of the house. And depending on the newspaper, he's like, well, that's their politics. Like, I know who they are now because they have that newspaper. So the assumption was that you would drift towards a newspaper that aligned with your views. However, there's an important qualifier there, which is newspapers very often would print and reprint things from the other paper and actually have the whole argument on the page. So it wasn't, as siloed, I guess, as we might say now, sometimes news is. There might be a strong statement on the part of one press, a strong counter statement on the part of the other, and then maybe some snarky stuff about the counter underneath it. But both sides of an argument, not always by far, but sometimes would be included in a single paper.
That's interesting. And that's something that I was just amazed by digging in historic newspapers, and particularly when I'm messing around on Chronicling America and I can see a bunch of them in a row. And it's very hard for me to not react and go, this is ridiculous. Like, you obviously are just wholesale cutting at each other's stuff. It's amazing.
It's totally true.
The extent to which plagiarism was just rampant.
But it wouldn't have been seen as plagiarism.
Right. Because you don't have copyright.
No, but it was passing along a conversation. I mean, there were reasons why editors could, there was no postage charge to editors sending newspapers to each other, because it was assumed that they would be pulling things from other newspapers and putting them in their own, right? Which is one of the interesting things. You can, when you research in early America, you can look for a story and then watch, follow the trail of where it gets republished, follow if it's the original version of it or another version of it. So there was nothing shady about that. It was just how to communicate over distance. But you're right that sometimes it's an argument being recreated. Sometimes it's just cutting and pasting, but it'll often say taken from the New York Journal.
Yeah. Interesting.
So there'll be a footnote sometimes. Yeah.
I didn't know that about the editor to editor bit. I just, particularly when it just looks absurd to the modern eye, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating because, but then even the recreated argument looks different in the, even though they might be reprinting the same four, like argument response in newspapers, everything, the framing of those things will be different in such a way that they'll look different in two different newspapers. So it's really interesting.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Becky says modern framing seems to be a function of the nationalism involved. The US media is reporting in a different way than colleagues in Europe and Asia. So can you comment just a little bit more about that role of nationalism in framing?
Well, I mean, what I can mostly offer is part of the study that I was referring to when I was speaking. That same study, I believe, found that local newspapers have far more descriptive or explanatory articles than national newspapers, which are all about the competition. Mm-hmm. So it does suggest that on a national level, you're talking big party arguments that are about the big parties more than anything else. And on a local level, the parties matter, but people also, those newspapers can be also more informative because maybe they're less part of the party machinery than some of the major press outlets are. So yeah, I do think that there is that kind of a difference. And I didn't read the detail about the local papers, but it once again makes you realize that the decline of local newspapers for yet another reason is a big problem.
Interesting. All right. Sorry, it's such a wonderful big list. Thank you all. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. So we do have just probably a final one here from
Okay.
Clint. Any thoughts about the effect of framing on viewers who he says, who are illiterate of the language used by those attempting to frame?
Interesting. Well, what's interesting, I mean, I have no absolute answer for that, but what it does make me think of is, and I've done this sometimes, when there's some, I don't know, some politician speaking about something vitally important and it's on TV. Sometimes if you turn off the sound and watch their face and their gestures, thinking to yourself about what it seems they're saying versus what happens when you turn the sound on is a really interesting experiment. And sometimes I read an article once that said people who lip read, who depend on watching people's faces as opposed to, so people who are hard of hearing or are deaf, who lip read and focus on reading people's faces to understand what they're saying, are very well attuned to when people appear to be lying. You can see it on their face. So yeah, I do think there are ways in which you can pull messages that are or aren't bound up with the words. But try it. It's really interesting. If you, even just now, we could do it. Go on online and find some, rousing speech or something that you heard and had strong feelings about, and then turn off the sound and see if it looks or different, or if the meaning being communicated is different. It's just really interesting to see.
Fascinating. Thank you.
No, you don't want to turn off the sound and watch me speak. Someone sent me the most ridiculous, and it amused the hell out of me, a string of my facial expressions, like image by image by image, as I was lecturing. And it's truly, I was like, and I was another one of those faces. It was like, wow, I'm really expressive.
Joanne, if you just go to our YouTube page and scroll down, you can get a similar effect.
Okay.
And you are uniformly pleasant and excited in so many different ways.
I'll see if I can find that and during the after party. But at any rate, okay, I know we're over time. So let me say, as always, thank you guys for showing up and engaging in this conversation, engaging in democracy every Friday morning, as you always do, and for being such an engaged community. I hope that you all have a wonderful week ahead. I hope that I see a lot of you Saturday night, tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, I believe, right?
That's right.
8 o'clock for History Matters, and so do cocktails. Where, oh, there you go, poof.
Yeah.
My poof is I can't give up the poof. That tomorrow evening we will join as a community. And I was thinking this morning, maybe one of the things we can do as we're drinking is talk about thinking about history over the course of the last 100 episodes. Like, what the heck? How do you think about history over the course of the time we've been doing this show? I don't know. We'll figure out what we want to talk about, but I hope many of you will come. And it's the same address, right? It's going to be the same. So you will be able to find
the same place you always come. And I think it'll even be this. No, it's a different link, but it's just click it right there. If you just go to ncheteach.org/conversations, click Joanne, you can see that right there. It's right at the top. You can even go and look now for those of you who.
That's right. So I hope you will join us. This will be fun. I have not decided yet what cocktail I'm going to make, but I will come up with one. And stay safe. Yeah, that's right. Last year I talked about the mammoth cheese a lot. At any rate, I'll turn things over to Grace to sign off on behalf of NCHE and the wonderful conference that's going on right now.
Yes. Well, thank you all again for being here. We're just thrilled that you can be here with us. We hope that you continue to join us every Friday. And also, as Joanne said, our conference is happening right now. Check that out at ncheteach.org/conference. We've got incredible breakout sessions and activities and keynote speakers. And if you need professional learning certificates, we have those. So lots of good stuff. But yes, definitely do come party with us tomorrow night at History Matters and So Do Cocktails, March 19th at 8 o'clock Eastern.
I forgot that I said poof and I forgot to talk about the after party.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my gosh. Catherine is like, did I miss? No after party? No. There is, of course, an after party. I said poof and threw myself off. So yes, we are going to have an after party. We are going to switch into it right now. If you want to join us, all it means is that we won't be recording so that we can be a little freer and easier in our conversations. If you are here already through ncheteach.org/conversations, just stay here and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching on Facebook and would like to join into the after party, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations, and then you will be part of that too. Oh my gosh, look at how like trained I am. I said the word poof and I was like, well, done my duty. So yes, we are now going to go to the after party. And
right.
Everybody.
Thank you all very much. We'll see you here next week, or we'll see you in just a second.